It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Neil Mitchell, who holds the 6th century chair of politics. 6th century, that's... in the School of Social Science at the University of Aberdeen. Prior to Aberdeen, he held positions at the University of New Mexico, Iowa State University, and Grinnell. He has written broadly on topics related to political action and the irrationality of collective choice, civil wars, democratization and human rights, and political stability in general. His most recent book is Agents of Atrocity, Leaders, Followers, and the Violation of Human Rights in Civil Wars. Today he will examine two such agents, Cromwell and Lenin, both leaders during insurrections, but leaders who acted with very different orientations towards the greater good. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mitchell.
Thank you, Don. Thank you for inviting me to this. And I don't actually get the chance to operate in a multidisciplinary environment very often, and so this has really been very welcome, very stimulating couple of days. I actually would have appreciated it, though, if you'd noted my cooperative behavior in being willing to be shifted down the order to the lunchtime pre-lunch speaker. But anyway, let me get started. My research is about conflict at the moment, about civil wars in particular, and I'm interested in the question of whether civil wars are more or less destructive to the societies in which they happen, and put civilian populations at greater or lesser risk. Much of social science has addressed this question with actually the sort of assumption that civil wars themselves are sort of equally bad, a sort of war is hell approach to civil wars, which I think is a quotation from a general who was that's not totally unfamiliar in these parts. But the other element of the traditional approach has been to try to look at the sorts of structural factors that account for human rights violations, and they include warfare as one of the structural factors. And I should confess that I used this approach for a long time, but gradually got less and less interested, more and more interested in questions of the individuals involved, what their motives were, and what their relationships with each other were. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. This is the standard model that was used, and still is used, to explain human rights violations in much of political science, and it has a sort of fairly consistent now list of variables that are included to explain which countries are likely to be most nasty in terms of their human rights performance. And in terms of human rights, I should be clear, I'm talking about what are sometimes referred to as physical integrity rights, which is essentially government use of coercion in the form of killing, torture, and imprisonment. And obviously human rights is now a much broader term than that, but that's the focus of has been the focus of my work. So generally, these studies have shown that gross national product per capita, levels of development matter in terms of levels of human rights violations, that the poorer countries generally perform worse, that trade levels and foreign direct investment levels matter, that higher levels of trade and foreign direct investment generally mean lower levels of human rights violations. Democracy matters, and the measurement of democracy over the years has become increasingly sophisticated. So now the latest work on this suggests that you need actually to reach a pretty high threshold level of democracy, full democracy, if you like, in order for it to improve human rights performance. Otherwise, military regimes, or whether they're left-wing regimes, haven't had all that much impact in terms of levels of human rights violations. I should explain that British colonialism variable. This was first put into this model by McCormack and myself in 1988. And the reason we put it in there was because there was really a lack of theory about why violations happened. And so we went to democratic theory, and there was this old argument that British colonies generally were more likely to become, or former British colonies more likely to become democracies. So we thought, well, maybe we can transfer that to a government's use of coercion. So we plugged in British colonialism to see whether that worked out. I've since heard it referred to as the bogus British colonialism variable. And I must say, as I said, the theorizing behind it was to begin with fairly loose, and why it was included in the democracy argument was interesting. And I'd seen one version where it was an argument essentially about whether a country had learned to play cricket or not. And the idea was that if you'd learned to play cricket, you'd learned also to be a good loser, and that this would help you in democratic politics, and you would be able to wait your turn till you did in fact win, rather than jump the gun. But obviously not all British colonies managed to acquire the taste for cricket, but yet still have developed some level of democracy. So perhaps that's not as persuasive as it might be. As I said, it hasn't really turned out as all that important in the analyses. But it often still gets stuck in there, and I think it's that people just sort of leave it in there because earlier studies have had it without really evaluating the model very critically. Warfare matters and population matters, but population, I think, is largely a sort of control variable in that the normal measures of human rights violations that are used in this work don't control for population size. So the larger the country, the more likely you're going to get some level of political violence. Now, I confess to my frustration with this model, in part because it was sort of a default model, that it was loosely theorized, and in part it represented what there were available measures for that could be loosely related to the levels of human rights observation or violation. But the other part of it for me was simply that it didn't talk about the individuals involved. It didn't talk about leaders and motives and the relationship between leaders and those who actually carried out the violence. After all, average per capita income, a trade balance, or the absence of elections have disappeared or tortured no one. So I wanted to look at the individuals involved. And the way I went about this is probably very unsatisfactory to a large number of psychologists here, but I looked for some very general motives that might explain what's happening. And I think there are three motives that matter. There's Machiavelli's motive, which is the self-interested pursuit of power. There's the Grand Inquisitor's motive, which is a dogmatic intolerance of other people. And then the third motive is the agent's motive, and I'm probably using this term selfish far too loosely in the light of the earlier morning talks here, but what has generally not been recognized in the literature is that the leaders who give the orders actually don't carry out the violations themselves. They delegate that task to other individuals who bring their own motivations to the table. So leaders order this sort of violence to destroy challengers to their power, or to destroy those they see on the wrong side of the political argument. And as I say, the archetypal figures are Machiavelli and the Grand Inquisitor. Two figures, and this is again for the benefit of my psychological audience here, two figures who, like Oedipus and Electra, bring tragedy to the political family. I thought you'd like that flourish. And then, as I say, there's the agents who carry out the violence. So let me try to demonstrate this visually for you. It's not actually. I almost was ashamed of bringing or presenting these slides after the dynamic slideshows we've seen here, but this is the best I can do. What the figure shows is the amount of harm delivered or violations delivered at various threat levels by these variously motivated leaders. So we have at the top the Inquisitor. This is the Grand Inquisitor from Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, who is just inelastically cruel. He is after heretics, however submissive they are, whether they're in flight or fight mode. Then there's the opportunist, or this is Machiavelli's motive, and this is the leader who ratchets up the violations to deal with threats to his or her power. So as threat levels rise, then countermeasures rise too. The opportunist, I should say actually that this figure is obviously the perfect archetypes. Just as markets aren't perfect, we're unlikely to find perfect representatives of these leaders in real life. But I think it's helpful to think to some degree about leaders in these ways. So we have the opportunist who ratchets up levels of violence to deal with threats. And then because we could argue that commitment led to higher levels of violations with the Grand Inquisitor, it seemed logical to think that another set of commitments could lead to someone like the Tolerator, who would rather resign or lose power than silence one opinion. And so for a while I thought of labeling the Tolerator John Stuart Mill, but then I decided that would probably get me into a real debate with real philosophers, so I was cautious at that point. But you get the idea, and as I say, this is a sort of political version of perfect competition, if you like. You don't expect to find these types perfectly in the real world. So with the Tolerator, you will find at different threat levels some sort of perhaps pragmatic concession to restrictions on liberty through the course of the emergency. And then we have to deal with the third motive, the agents. So as I say, the leader gets others to do the violence. And as we know from principal agent analysis and the analysis of regulation, there are obstacles to controlling one's agents, and the two principal obstacles to controlling agents, to controlling those to whom you delegate a task, are that they bring their own selfish interests with them, and also that there's this problem of information asymmetry, that the agents themselves have a better grasp of what's going on and a better grasp of their own character and predispositions than you do. And your counter move is to monitor them, but monitoring them is costly and will presumably at some point make nonsense of the idea of delegating. So these are well-known obstacles to control. Now, if we look at this issue in terms of conflict and what happens with one's agents in security forces, then the sorts of selfish motivation that we're talking about here may be that somebody in the security force has some private interest, private good in the human rights violations. So in fact, you will end up delivering more violations than you as the leader had in mind because of that private interest and because of the obstacles to control. And from our very first record, our very first record was a record about conflict, here we have an example of the Greeks being urged on by Agamemnon to take the city of Troy, with the promise of the prospect of ill-treating the civilians in the city of Troy. And it's unashamedly said this. What's interesting in a way about this war is that both principals and agents are privately motivated. There's very little strategic motive at work here. It's essentially about private motivations. And the thing ground to a halt for a long time because two of the leaders were squabbling over Achilles and Agamemnon were squabbling over a slave girl. So I move us rapidly forward here. This is before the walls of Harfleur in northern France, and this is Shakespeare's Henry V. And if I'd have been clever, I would have had Kenneth Branagh or Laurence Olivier delivering this speech to you, which I'm sure we could have actually arranged by YouTube clip, and actually perhaps we could fix this on the video version of this talk. But this is Henry V talking to the governor of Harfleur. And essentially what he's saying to them is, and what you can see happening here is that something has happened along the way from Troy to Harfleur, something has happened. And that something is moral stigma. That there is now moral stigma attached to the prospect of ill-treating the civilians of Harfleur. There's no doubt that Shakespeare's Henry V sees these things as offensive action, not just offensive in taking the city. But what he says is that he will not have control of his agents. That once they get into the city, we may as bootless spend our vain command upon the enraged soldiers in their spoil as send precepts to the Leviathan to come ashore. It will be beyond his control. And So the governor of Harfleur thinks about this and surrenders, and in fact the city is taken, but the people are spared. Now, in thinking about this, there's a number of interesting things here to think about. It's interesting to think about in relation to the Battle of Agincourt, which happens just weeks afterwards. And there, Henry V was in perfect control of presumably his agents' fear when they faced a far larger number of French soldiers. But he claims here that he could not control their greed. And so one thinks perhaps that well, this is a complicated hero, this Henry V. One thinks perhaps that he's being a bit disingenuous in saying that in fact he wouldn't be able to control his soldiers. And actually, there's a description of an actual violation that happens in Henry V, in Shakespeare's Henry V, at Agincourt, where the English and Welsh soldiers, and Scots and Irish soldiers there too, slaughter the French prisoners they've taken because a party of French knights gets in amongst the English baggage train and slaughters the boys who are looking after the baggage train. So reciprocally, Henry V orders them to kill their French prisoners, and he offers then another reason for doing that, because they're expecting another charge from the French, and that all these prisoners behind their lines would be a security threat too. But what's interesting actually in both the Laurence Olivier film of Henry V and Kenneth Branagh's film is that bit's edited out of, that violation is edited out of the film, not out of the play. It's in Shakespeare's play, but not in the films. And Laurence Olivier perhaps had a better excuse than Kenneth Branagh for doing that, because his film was in 1944, and Britain and France were allies in the imminent invasion, so perhaps it was a diplomatic thing at that point, but Kenneth Branagh's Henry V should have perhaps included that. And so we move up to today, and the continuing importance of this agent's motive in terms of levels of human rights violations. Now, what I've done is tried to give you the general argument that I'm pursuing, the three motives, and now I'll try to persuade you that there is actual evidence for some of this. And the cases I've chosen are the English Civil War in the middle of the 17th century and the Russian Civil War from 1917-18 to 1921. And the cases are interesting in that, as much as you can ever select in any sort of comparative case study sort of approach any two exactly comparable cases, very difficult to do, but there are reasons for comparison here. Both these wars were wars of government control. And there are other types of civil wars, notably separatist or ethnic-based civil wars, and these wars weren't separatist wars. The separatist wars, and sort of contemporary political science researchers have argued that separatist wars are generally nastier sorts of wars, but we see here both of these we're controlling for the type of civil war, and one is relatively has relatively low levels of violations, and one has very high levels of violations. They both faced very severe threat the outcome was not certain in either case. Both had third-party interventions from other countries, and in the English Civil War's case, it was from Scotland and potentially from Ireland. Both were fought in the context of major international wars, so directly prior to the, well, and actually during the Russian Revolution and Civil War was the ending of the First World War. And with the English Civil War, it was the sort of northern periphery of the 30 Years' War, both of which were wars marked with obviously large-scale loss of life at the time. What's actually interesting is a lot of the soldiers who fought in the English Civil War, Scottish, Irish and English soldiers, had previously seen service in the 30 Years' War on the continent, which was fought in a very different way. I also argue that both these wars feature some common problems. So I think that it's a useful comparison because we can hold the level of threat roughly constant, and we can vary the leaders involved. And also it's an interesting comparison because Lenin specifically invited us to compare his civil war and his use of terror with the use of terror by the British bourgeoisie in 1649. He was facing, even 1918, severe criticism not only from the bourgeoisie abroad, but from workers abroad who were concerned about the level of violence at the time in Russia. So he felt he needed to respond and did so in this way, which was essentially that revolutions are necessarily violent. So these are the common problems that I identify. Is this impossible to see at the back there? I apologize for that. The three problems that I identify are that both leaders faced what I call the captive monarch problem. They both ended up with the representative of the old regime in captivity. They both faced at some stage mutiny from within their own forces, and interestingly, in both cases, more revolutionary elements than perhaps the leaders were themselves. So it was the Leveller mutiny in the English Civil War, who were real Democrats, and the Kronstadt mutiny in the Russian Civil War, the sailors who dedicated to the revolution, but by 1921 were themselves fed up with the operation of the secret police and the level of violence, particularly against other socialists who were not communists. And then they both faced the problem of what to do about non-combatants. So first of all, this captive monarch problem, and obviously it was a suboptimal execution for Charles I, but it was also a suboptimal execution for Cromwell. And the reason for this was that it was unprecedented to put a king on trial, which is what happened to Charles I. It was a public execution. There was an execution warrant which was signed by 59 members of Parliament and of the court that tried Charles I, including Oliver Cromwell, third on the list. It was an execution just of Charles I. It didn't include his relatives, who, if you left them around, were likely to be quite bitter about this. And it involved a loss of political support that Cromwell knew that would happen to him. So in these senses, a most un-Machiavellian decision. The loss of support was in part because they allowed Charles I a very dignified exit. He was as dignified as this sort of thing can be, I suppose. He was executed in Whitehall in the middle of the day. It was a cold January day, and he stepped out a window of Banqueting House, which borders on Whitehall, and which has this magnificent ceiling that actually Charles I commissioned by Rubens. Anyway, he stepped out the window onto the scaffold, and he apparently, it may be apocryphal, but he apparently asked for an extra shirt to wear on that day because it was cold and he didn't want to be seen shivering and thought to be afraid. So they apparently gave him an extra shirt. He gave a short speech and then was executed. And the crowd apparently groaned in sympathy. And the loss of political support, not just in terms of domestic political support, but also in terms of criticism from foreign powers, and Scotland immediately making Charles II the heir. But what it also did actually was engage John Milton on Cromwell's side to write pamphlets defending the decision to publicly execute the king. Now, and this is a sort of, well, again, this question of what constitutes evidence here, but this is counterfactual evidence. But if Cromwell, I argue, had been a Machiavellian, then Charles would have died more in the way that the Tsar died, in a cellar at midnight, and not with Lenin remotely close to the action. And in fact, the action was blamed on the decision of some local government officials in the Urals. And that's how Cromwell should have handled it. He should have had Charles have a hunting accident. He was allowed to hunt while he was in captivity. He should have had an overzealous guard, one of his agents, and he could have delegated the blame then to the agent. Have an overzealous guard kill the king while the king tried to escape, and the king did escape as far as the Isle of Wight. He should have had him taken ill while in a cold and clammy castle, and pass away that way. That's what a Machiavellian, how a Machiavellian would have proceeded, tried to evade accountability for this act, and as I say, Cromwell did the contrary. In terms of levels of violence, I'm focusing here on the use of sexual violence in these civil wars, and I think this in some ways is a barometer of the degree of principal agent problems that you encounter from wars to wars to wars, that higher levels of sexual violence indicate a higher sort of agent contribution to the overall level of human rights violations, that sexual violence is a particularly agent-centered violation that may have some strategic purpose. In Amnesty's reports, annual reports, there's, with a very few countries, reference to the use of rape as a weapon of war, but that's relatively rare, and it's used in reference to the Congo, for example. So there is a contrast in terms of the way the two armies behaved in terms of levels of violence. I attribute this in part to recruitment of agents that Cromwell took care in terms of who was recruited into the new model army. And also then once in the army, to the generation of some articles of war that institutionalized a combat morality in his soldiers, and which was enforced as well. That, for example, before the worst atrocities of the Cromwellian army were in Ireland, and particularly in the city of Drogheda. Prior to arriving at the walls of Drogheda, though, he'd punished 2 of his soldiers for plundering in Ireland. So the abuses essentially were identified as abuses, communicated to the soldiers, and then punishment was followed if they didn't observe these moral duties. In contrast, there seems to have been little care taken in terms of recruits to the Cheka, this forerunner of the KGB, and you can see these historians of the conflict testifying to the very powerful agent motive that was at work in terms of recruitment to service in this institution. So we can follow up if you want about Ireland and elsewhere, but let me just try to sum up what I've been arguing. These are, I would argue, to some degree comparable sorts of wars, with leaders who face comparable sorts of problems. But there were very different outcomes for the combatants and non-combatants. The Russian Civil War has been described as a forgotten Holocaust, and because of what came afterwards, the tendency is to focus, I think, on Stalin, but estimates are as high as 10 million people dying in that 4-year period from all causes, including disease and famine. But in terms of estimates of victims of Red Terror alone, those figures are now at least between 1 and 2 million dying. I argue that Machiavelli is both right and wrong. I argue that there is support for, I think, what is a general proposition of the Prince, that leadership and management matters. The book is about, well, it's advice to a prince, but it's about history, and it's about the influence of leaders, or the potential influence of leaders on history. And he argued that what mattered, was luck. About 50% was down to luck for leaders, but the other 50% was virtue, and not virtue as we might understand it, but virtue in the sense of the lion and the fox, virtue in terms of being bold, courageous, deceitful when you want. Blame your Spanish minister should at some point there come a need to stop the violations. The threat has passed. Find a scapegoat then to blame. And Machiavelli's a description of Cesar Borgia, he says Borgia blamed his Spanish minister, left him dead, cut up in his, dead and mutilated, I suppose, in a town square, which he said left the people stunned and satisfied. So trickery, boldness, and cruelty were a necessary part of the repertoire of a successful prince. And I think when I say that Machiavelli right and wrong, I think in that sense, Cromwell is an example of somebody who by and large suggests that Machiavelli was wrong in this, that leaders could be successful without following his advice in terms of being absolutely ruthless. A contemporary royalist historian described Cromwell as a non-Machiavellian, in the sense that if he'd been Machiavellian, he would have destroyed the royalist party as a whole. And he also argues that there was a point at which there was rumours of a plot to kill the king while in captivity, and Cromwell's reaction was to increase the guard around the king to safeguard him from this sort of action. I'll call it the vanity of giving individuals influence over political and military events, but I suppose what I'm talking about there is just this general argument that we must pay attention to leaders' values, and for my purposes, their commitment to toleration is critical, and their willingness and energy to monitor what their agents are doing in their name. So finish up just a little bit in terms of how I'm going to try and continue this research agenda. Sadly, political scientists are not going to be convinced by Homer and Shakespeare, so they probably want more evidence for the sorts of arguments that I'm making here. So what I've tried to do is I've focused on the agent's contribution, and so one piece I've tried to look at the amount of, on a large-scale comparative basis, and sort of going back to the methods that got me interested in this subject area in the beginning, and looking at the degree of control over agents in security forces as globally as possible, which is actually difficult to measure, as you can appreciate, and seeing how this has an impact on levels of human rights violations. The second project I'm working on is a project on pro-government militias. And one way for a modern Machiavellian prince to evade accountability is not to use his or her own security forces, but to rely on more informal groups to do the violence. So I'm looking at, and actually trying to collect data with colleagues at Nottingham University on the presence of, identifying the presence of pro-government militias around the world. It's interesting that there's actually no data on that to this point. And the question ultimately will be which sorts of leaders, which sorts of systems rely on this choice of agent to carry out the violence rather than on their regular forces. And then I've got another final project, which is to look at what happens after abuse and atrocity, and how leaders manage the blame for violations that happened under them. And I'm focusing on democratic leaders. So I'm looking at a number of cases in British and American history up and including to the conflict in Iraq. So it stretches from the Amritsar massacre in India in 1919 by a British general to Abu Ghraib. And I'm afraid to report that there Machiavelli is more right than wrong in how leaders behave after the event, in that generally they do try to find fall guys and to delegate the blame to an agent. So thank you.
Questions?
Is it on?
Yes.
Yes. I was thinking of this, I guess this is the way that I often think about what causes these kind of human rights violations. I was thinking of it in terms of conversations we've been having about the individual mind versus the collective mind, and I know that there's often an explanation that comes from, the social psychologists would have a better term for it, but around contagion and mob mentality and the likelihood of sort of creation of these through desensitization and these creation of these sort of abnormal norms that make individuals who are part of, in this case, the agents, do things that they would never do as rational individuals if they followed their own belief system before they found themselves in this situation. And I wonder, that's a very common explanation for human rights atrocities, right? Is this mob mentality, and even not just in a single instance, but in an ongoing campaign. And I wonder, is that a complementary explanation for this? Would this fit within your explanation in some way or not?
Yes, I think it would fit. Thank you for that question. It does fit in terms of the agent's motives, and I said at one point in a talk on this very issue, I said that the agents were essentially after revenge, plunder, or sex, and at that point I got corrected and said, that sexual violence wasn't about sex; it was about power and so on. So I then thought about it a bit more carefully, and I suppose what I come up with is the agent is seeking some sort of gratification, be it about power, possibly about revenge, but it also could be to ingratiate himself with his peer group, which I think is along the lines that you're talking about. And there's been an interesting debate on this in terms of the willingness of individuals to participate in the Holocaust. And there was an argument by a historian about how essentially it was driven almost in its entirety by ideological motives. But others have argued that yes, there were some who were genuinely committed, but there were others who simply went along because it was what the rest of the group was doing. And I've seen that analysis too with regard to conduct in Vietnam as well, that there were some individuals motivated to do the violation itself, but then there were others who did the violation in order to maintain their group status or membership.
You put the American Civil War into play by quoting General Sherman, "War is hell and you cannot refine it." and I was just wondering if you have any comment on Lincoln or Jefferson Davis in terms of the of the polarities of Cromwell and Lenin.
Yeah, obviously on very dangerous ground. I think the only more dangerous ground for me is to actually go to Ireland to give this talk, which I've not done to this point. But I am actually very interested in the American Civil War. And what was interesting, and I know a bit more about the Union side than the Confederate side, but what was interesting was that even with Sherman, and I certainly couldn't say this, I know, in Atlanta, but even with Sherman, it seems as though his troops were generally relatively well behaved. They weren't behaving badly by Russian standards, if you like. Little Hart commented on, who's a British military historian, commented on a Confederate general who described Sherman's march through Georgia as something as the worst of all possible military exercises. And Little Hart argued that it simply indicated this Confederate general's lack of knowledge about warfare in general. But I think what is true to say about Georgia and the march through Georgia was also that levels of rape were very low. I don't think there really is much record or good evidence that there was much of that going on, which suggests that he did have control of his men, and he certainly had a code of conduct, this Lieber code of conduct, which it and actually Cromwell's code of conduct were in many ways in advance of international law, because it wasn't until 1949 that the Geneva Convention actually identified rape as a violation by name. The Hague Convention, 1907, had talked about family honor and protecting family honor, but it didn't explicitly identify rape until 1949. So, as I say, I'm not sure I would risk these comments about the American Civil War in obviously a very civilized audience, tolerant audience here, but yes.
You didn't talk about, unless I missed it, about what would account for the differences in the different leaders' behavior. And it seems to me to explain that, certainly at one level you'd have to go to their basic philosophy and political ideals. In England, even at the stage of Cromwell, there was some concept of rights. I think it was before John Locke, but the concept wasn't unknown then. And the communists, of course, were contemptuous of the whole concept of individual rights. And certainly in the American Civil War, we had Declaration of Independence and the like in the Constitution. So if you looked at the political ideology of the leaders as a factor in how they would treat the people they were fighting.
That actually is my the driving force of my explanation is in terms of the values of the leaders involved, and I argue that there's good evidence from Cromwell's own letters and speeches and from historians about his commitment to toleration and to liberty of conscience, and then I use evidence from Lenin's letters and speeches and biographers to try to establish his commitment to this essentially dogmatic intolerance of any groups who seem to be at odds with his conception of history and his conception of the good of all. So in that is fundamental to the argument about the leaders.
I have two questions or comments. First question is, what relation or how do you, in your research, distinguish between language used before the conflict, which is a threat, which sometimes in the first quotes you brought, but in the War of Troy and Henry V, that was language that served as a threat towards the enemies.
That's right, yes.
And I wonder if you have seen a relationship between threats, which, as we know, I mean, they accomplish a function that is not necessarily, that maybe is even to prevent the conflict, right?
Yes.
If I you know, is threat and they frighten enough, then maybe we don't have to go to war.
Yeah.
And so the more violent the previous language, maybe we get less conflict or
Right.
okay. And then what happens with that violent previous language and actual behavior after, if they go to war?
Yes.
Because my problem in Venezuela, for example, is that political language by the dictator we have now is very violent, and my problem has been how to measure events, I mean the violence in events from language. I mean how language affects behavior in essence. And then the second one has to do with the Machiavellian measure. I mean, how can we decide, how can a leader decide when he should act by himself or have agents to do the deed? Because it seems to me that that depends also on the people's emotions and the followers' emotions and how they react to the leader. Because sometimes it is good for a leader who is manipulating the emotions of his followers to do the act, the deed, you know, the violent deed by themselves. And the publicity of the king by Cromwell and all that maybe had this Foucault's idea of the purpose of public hangings and public executions. So how can a leader distinguish between, I mean, is there a Machiavellian way to distinguish when a leader should exert the act by himself because that will bring him followers, because he's manipulating the emotions and he's responding to the emotions of his followers, and when must he contract agents to do them?
Well, I think with respect to whether the leader should know whether he should be Machiavellian or not, I think Cromwell would just simply not recognize that question. I think essentially he was true to himself and to his set of beliefs. So he was going to do these things even if it lost support. I think he probably could have been pretty confident of, but not at all times, pretty confident of the support of a large number of the army. But there was, as I say, a mutiny that he had to deal with. But I think he, in the end, was simply true to himself, so he did these unpopular things. He also, 350 years after the Jews had been expelled from England, he allowed the Jews publicly back into England in 1657, setting up of a synagogue. And that apparently was an unpopular act, yet Cromwell did it all the same because of his commitment to toleration. Now, the first question in terms of language, I think you can say that, well, perhaps Henry V saved lives by making these fearsome threats, and he achieved his objective efficiently. But certainly Machiavelli would have no problem with that recourse. In terms of the use of language, I think it's also very important often enough in terms of motivating people to do violence, because it's not always easy to do that. And I think using language to identify the otherness of those who threaten you is an important component of the explanation of violation.